If you're in the field of artificial neural networks and need to understand how the brain processes information, because there are a lot of inspiration and a lot of type of information exchange infrastructure that is happening at the brain cells and neuron level that potentially gives rise to a lot of the design of artificial intelligence neural networks, then it's very important to understand some of the basics of neuroscience. More importantly, the areas that have already been debunked in the field of neuroscience and the areas in which we are more confident about, and understanding these phenomena would then potentially help us to draw a better and more realistic parallels to combine the way in which biology works and the way in which we should design the artificial neural networks, artificial biologies in this case. So today we're gonna continue our conversation that we had last time, and hopefully it will clarify things a little bit more for you guys. The notion that information flows within the brain like it does in computers, such as zeros and ones, neurons off and on, has been a dominant phenomena and metaphor in neuroscience in the past. In this view, a spike of a neuron is like a dot or a dash in a code, and each neuron is thought of as a sender or a receiver of these code signals. This idea worked well for explaining simple sensory systems. For example, early visual researchers observed that certain neurons would fire more in response to specific features, such as edges or movements. From that, it seemed natural to imagine that spike as a message carrying some kind of a meaning or information about the external world. However, this metaphor started to break down as we moved beyond simple stimulus-response relationship within the neurons. The deeper we look into how neurons function collectively, the more we realize that the brain does not transmit information through isolated symbolic messages. Instead, it operates as a highly dynamic system in which meaning is constructed contextually. A spike of a neuron on its own does not inherently mean anything. Its significance depends entirely on when it happens, where it happens, what other neurons are doing, and what kind of rhythm the network is currently oscillating within, as in the brainwaves frequencies. To make this concrete, imagine a neuron in the visual cortex that fires in response to a certain pattern of light, for example. Whether this spike ends up influencing the downstream neurons depends not only on the spike of the neuron itself, but also on the precise timing relative to the ongoing brain rhythms or brainwaves frequencies. If it arrives during a peak excitability, it might have a strong impact. Otherwise, it might not have a strong impact. This shows that a spike influence is shaped by the temporal structure of the network. In addition to timing, population coding plays a central role. No single neuron tells the brain what it is seeing. Instead, groups of neurons fire together in specific patterns that represent features, concepts, or actions. These patterns are constantly shifting based on context, goals, expectations, and learning history. A neuron might participate in many different patterns depending on what the brain is doing at that particular time. So, the same spike from the same neuron can participate in completely different mental processes depending on the surrounding activities of the neurons within that neural network. And this is where we start to see that the notion of the neurons just communicating by being off and on metaphor does not hold anymore. In fact, it's quite incomplete. It is misleading to some extent, even in the off and on exchange of information, the metaphor that we used to have in neuroscience. A symbol always has a fixed meaning. In the brain, a spike's meaning is not fixed, however. It is shaped by context, learning, and the neural network states. And neuroscientists have increasingly turned to ideas from dynamical systems and analog computation to better describe this process. The brain is not a message passing machine. Instead, it's a self-organizing system that generates internal patterns to represent and respond to the world. And this is where we say that it's going away from this digital way of communicating, which is on and off, to analog way of computing, which is more wave-like. One of the most influential neuroscientists in the field, Professor Earl Miller at the MIT, is one of those researchers who's pushing this view forward, in as to say, not digital but analog way of computation within the brain. His work shows that cognition and working memory are driven not by fixed symbols or isolated spikes within the brain, but by coordinated waves or neural oscillations of population activity. In his lab, his findings show that what a neuron represents can shift rapidly depending on tasks, demands, and cognitive goals. This flexibility cannot be explained by static codes and or the digital codes, which is off and on of a neuron. It requires a model where meaning emerges from population of neurons, the dynamic way of population of neurons, phase relationships, and oscillatory coordination, which is the brainwaves frequency coordination. And so this brings us to the role of brainwaves frequencies, that they do not carry specific content the way a neural spike might be said to represent as a feature. Instead, they provide a temporal structure in which spikes of the neurons can become meaningful. You can think of brainwaves as the syntax of a conversation. They create windows of opportunity in which information can be processed and or ignored. A spike of a neuron that occurs during a phase of high excitability of the brain may trigger a specific network response, but the same spike during a phase of inhibition may be suppressed. This means brain waves frequency shape when and how an information flows through circuits of neurons without carrying the content themselves. The modern scientific consensus, supported by evidence from multi-electrode recordings, for example, imaging as well as computational models, is that brain activity is deeply contextual and dynamic. Spikes of neurons only acquire meaning through participations in patterns that evolve over time within the neural networks. These patterns are modulated by oscillations, the waves, shaped by plasticity, the way in which we learn, and influenced by behavioral state of the person. The brain does not decode messages. Instead, it builds meaning through interactions of neurons as well as the brainwaves frequencies. In this newer view of information processing within the brain becomes its own model of the world. It builds internal representations through layers of coordinated activities. These representations are not like words in a sentence. They are more like complex choreographies of activities across vast neural networks. Each neuron contributes to many such patterns, and its role changes depending on the context. This is not symbolic transmission, it is an emergent computation. The brain is then more like a musical ensemble than a telegraph system. In telegraph system, the neurons are off and on, and that's how the information flows. But in music ensemble, it's more like a wave-like coordination of information. And the significance of a note in this musical ensemble depends on the harmony, the rhythm, and the timing of all the instruments together. One single note played out of context may not sound meaningful, but in the right context, it contributes to a larger piece of music. This is how spikes work in the brain. They participate in a larger symphony of activity that together give rise to the perception, to thought, and to action, and brain waves frequencies are the coordinator of these musical instruments being played. The idea that the neural spikes are not messages with fixed meanings represent a profound shift in how we understand brain functions today. For much of the 20th century, neuroscience borrowed heavily from telecommunications and computer science to describe brain activities. In this framework, neurons were imagined as messages that send and receive information, and spikes. Those brief electrical impulses that we call spikes were treated like symbols or bits of data in a code. This perspective is known as the neural coding metaphor. It assumed that each spike or pattern of spike of a neuron corresponded to some specific feature of the world, like a pixel in a visual image or a sound frequency in an auditory space. According to this old view, the brain acted like a decoding machine, interpreting incoming neural messages to form perceptions and or decisions. But eventually, this telecommunication-like metaphor to explain how the brain works turned out to be too simplistic to try to explain the brain. Spikes of neurons are not, for example, isolated symbols with one-to-one correspondence to the external world. Instead, their meaning, if we can even use the word meaning, depends entirely on the context in which they occur, not to mention the human in itself, their individuality. And so a spike of a neuron from one neuron might mean different things depending on which other neurons are firing at that moment in time, and when they are firing, and what state of the neural network the brain is in at that moment in time. And this is where the idea of population coding and neural dynamics, neural network dynamics, entered into the picture. Rather than thinking of individual neurons carrying independent messages, many neuroscientists now think of the brain as encoding information through patterns of activity across entire populations of neurons, and these patterns are dynamic, constantly shifting in response to both the external stimuli as well as the internal brain states. In this new population coding framework, meaning arises from the relationship between spikes of neurons across many neurons within the brain, not from any one spike in isolation. Imagine a single violinist playing a note, for example. That note means little without the rest of the orchestra. It is a combined harmony, rhythm, and interaction that conveys the emotion or the structure of the symphony. Similarly, in the brain, a spike's impact depends on its role in the broader neural patterns of the neural network activities. This relational view is further complicated by time. For example, not only does it matter which neurons fire, but also when they fire. This brings us to the temporal coding, where the timing between spikes down to the milliseconds can change what a signal does in the neural network of the brain. The temporal aspect of information processed within the brain, as in when the neurons fire, is where brain waves come into play. While spikes of neuron carry content, brain waves appear to provide the timing context in which the content is interpreted by the brain. Brain waves are rhythmic fluctuation in electrical activities across populations of neurons within the brain. They do not carry detailed information about the external world, but they seem to set the timing conditions under which spikes of neurons are more or less likely to influence other neurons. You can think of brain waves like the rhythm of a conversation. They don't tell you what a word is meaning and what it means, but it could convey what the emotional aspect of a conversation is, or when we should speak or when we should not speak, for example, like a gatekeeper. A spike that occurs during a peak of certain oscillation phase might be highly effective at activating a postsynaptic neuron, for example, but the same spike occurring during another type of oscillation might be ignored entirely. The temporal principle, as in the timing of the neuron, is seen clearly in phenomena like phase locking, where spikes of neuron tend to occur at specific phases of ongoing oscillations, waves, as in brain waves, especially in areas involved in sensory processing and attention. Research has shown that attention can modulate not just neurons fire, but when they fire within an oscillatory phases or the brainwaves phases cycle. In the visual cortex, for example, neurons that fire in sync with certain brainwaves phases are more likely to drive perception and behavior. This suggests that brainwaves act like a dynamic filter or a gate, so to speak, regulating the impact of spikes of neurons depending on when the neuron arrived relative to the ongoing rhythm, ongoing brainwaves. In this way, brainwaves impose a kind of syntax of neural communication, much like punctuation or pauses structure when we speak, for example, with one another or when we write sentences. And so understanding the brain is not just about knowing which neurons are active, but also about understanding the network's internal dynamic, timing, and rhythmic structure. It also suggests that any effort to replicate or model brain-like intelligence in machines must take timing and population level dynamics seriously. In traditional artificial neural networks, for example, information is often static and purely based on activation levels, but in the brain, computation is fundamentally dynamic and contextual. The dance of neural spikes and brain waves is not merely data transmission, it is very basis of cognition, perception, and meaning. In perception, this framework helps explain phenomena like contextual modulation, where the response of a neuron to a stimulus can change depending on the broader sensory or attentional context. A neuron in the visual cortex, for example, might fire in response to a line or an edge, but that response can be amplified, suppressed, or even reversed depending on what surrounds that stimulus or what the brain is expecting at that point in time. And this is not because the neuron changed its tuning properties, but because the broader network context, including timing and the oscillatory phases, as in which waves changed the condition under which the spike was interpreted. And so when we say that spikes are not messages with fixed meanings, we are acknowledging the complexity and the fluidity of neural computation. The brain does not decode spikes like, for example, we do in Morse code or in machines. Instead, it constructs meaning through a rich interplay of spatial and temporal patterns. It is not a passive receiver of signals, but an active participant in shaping and interpreting those signals. This view moves us away from linear or reductionist thinking and brings us more toward a system level understanding where dynamics, context, and coordinations are key. It opens the door to a more biologically grounded approach to building intelligent machines, one that respects the sophistication of how real brain computes. While the artificial neural networks today are extremely impressive in their pattern recognition, they remain relatively shallow compared to the brain's fluid, context-aware, and adaptive information processing. Neuroscience provides deep clues into how to move forward, especially when it comes to neural spikes, neural timing, and population activity, and the role of brainwaves activities. And so one of the lessons that the artificial neural networks can learn from the brain is that instead of using static activation values as we do in traditional neural networks, we can incorporate time as a fundamental part of the computation as well. In biological brains, neurons do not just fire to indicate how strongly they feel something. When they fire is also extremely critical. Timing carries meaning in the sense within the brain. The same spike can have a completely different effect depending on when it occurs. In spiking neural networks, for example, one effort of this model is as such. These systems are now being used to discrete spikes over time rather than continuous activation. In such models, information is encoded not just in how often a neuron fires, but in the specific timing of those spikes. And this is more aligned with how the brain, the biological brain, seems to represent and process information. Another way in which the artificial neural networks can learn from the biological brain is that the brain rarely relies on a single neuron or a pathway to carry information. Instead, meaning is represented across populations of neurons. And so this is called the population coding, as mentioned earlier. The identity of the neurons that fire, the timing of the firing, as mentioned, and the pattern across the whole ensemble from a representation perspective. And so in machine learning, this translates into shifting our attention from individual units to patterns across many units. Attention mechanisms, as used in transformer networks, for example, approximate this principle. As an example, they allow networks to dynamically assess and prioritize different parts of an input based on learned context. And so this mirrors the brain's way of modulating how much attention it pays to different streams of input depending on what it currently is relevant to. The third way in which artificial neural networks can learn from the biological neural networks is that we can introduce a deeper sense of context into the artificial neural networks. In the brain, for example, processing of information is always shaped by the ongoing internal state of the system. Neurons respond differently depending on where in an oscillatory cycle a spike lands. This means that spikes are not interpreted in isolation. They are modulated by larger brain waves of coordinated activities, often referred to as brain waves or brain rhythms. These brain waves serve as a kind of syntax, as mentioned earlier, that shapes meaning, and a spike during one phase of a rhythm, a wave, for example, might drive a strong response, whereas in others it has no effect. And so in artificial systems, we can draw from this by designing networks whose internal modules are rhythmical coordinations or selectively gated, like brainwaves do, based on the internal dynamics of the system. Some researchers are beginning to explore oscillations networks that incorporate this idea directly within the artificial neural networks. Lastly, a potential fourth way in which artificial neural networks can learn from the biological neural networks is that the way in which the brain learns is highly efficient and biologically plausible. Instead of using global error signals and back propagation, the brain adjusts its synaptic strength based on local activities. One, for example, well-studied mechanism in spike timing dependent is plasticity. This rule says that if one neuron consistently fires just before another neuron, their connection strengthens. If the order is reversed, for example, it weakens. These local time-sensitive rules allow for flexible learning that adapts in real time within our brain. In artificial neural networks, many researchers are working on biologically inspiring learning rules that are local, online, and very energy efficient. This could open the door to models that can learn continuously without needing to retrain those models from. And so perhaps the most important insight from neuroscience is that the brain is not a static feed-forward system. It's a dynamic system. It operates as a constantly shifting balance of excitation and inhibition, which activities that resonate which activities stabilize and change across time and space. Intelligence within the brain is not stored in fixed layers of neurons. In fact, it emerges from recurrent interactions that unfold in time. This means that truly brain-like computation must be embodied in dynamic systems. Neuromorphic computing, for example, that we talked about last time, tries to build hardware that captures this particular principle. These systems operate with spikes and local memory and respond asynchronously. They consume far less energy than current digital chips, for example, and can perform complex tasks using architectures that look more like the brain than your traditional circuits. And so the idea here is that by learning more and more about how our innate biological systems compute and processes information, we'll be able to get inspired and be able to create systems, artificial systems that are inspired from the very efficient way in which the biological system are already processing and communicating information. And that's all I had for you guys today. Hope you found it helpful, and thanks for your likes and comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye.